I'm Donald Eubank, co-founder of Read the Air, a sustainable business advisory firm here in Tokyo, and co-author with Trista Bridges of Leading Sustainably, The Path to Sustainable Business and How the SDGs Changed Everything. I'd like to thank the organizers of the World FinTech Festival for choosing the theme of Impact FinTech and giving us the opportunity to bring together this panel on how data will drive the impact revolution. I'm joined today by Anita Varshney, Donato Calace, and Karl Richter, who will introduce themselves in a moment. I'd like to provide a quick introduction to our subject first by imagining a Venn diagram of three overlapping circles: finance, sustainability, and technology. And we're at the middle where they converge with Impact FinTech. So what do we mean when we say impact? The Impact Management Project, which is a forum of 2,000 practitioners ranging from investors, asset owners, and foundations to international organizations, policymakers, and NGOs, has defined impact simply as a change in positive or negative outcome for people or the planet. And to take it a step further, the Global Impact Investing Network, or GIN, says that impact investments are investments made with the intention to generate positive, measurable, social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. And while we're not specifically talking about investing in this panel, I bring this up because in sustainable business circles and investing circles today, there's almost always a business case available that pairs good actions with profitability. Impact is important because, as we see it, impact is the bridge from ESG screening to the achievement of the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And ESG started with investors and is now becoming a tool of for business managers to make decisions around strategy and operational planning. But the practice of doing so is notoriously difficult, from collecting right data to structuring it with appropriate frameworks to understanding what the data is telling you. Add to that the field of sustainable accounting is fractured and continually evolving, and frankly, you have a right mess. So then, will data solutions, AI and other technologies, create clarity in these new realms of accounting and decision making and improve our ability to achieve impact? We'll discuss here through the lens of technological solutions how this field is rapidly evolving and the standards that regulators are grappling with, in particular around this idea of impact that companies and investors are trying to understand when it comes to how their activities affect society. We'll look at the solutions that Anita, Donato, and Karl are working on for collecting and analyzing data to simplify reporting and disclosure and to guide strategic decision making. To conclude, with apologies to Mark Andreessen, I'd say that what we're seeing is that not only is software eating the world, sustainability is taking a big bite as well. And we see these two fields coming together in the data management and insight solutions that we're going to look at today. So Anita, Donato, and Karl, can you each introduce yourselves and give us a description of what you're working on? We'll start with you, Anita, and then Donato and Karl.
Thank you so much for a great introduction. I'm very happy to be joined by some amazing panelists tonight at the festival. I'm Anita Varshney. I work at SAP. My work is focused around driving sustainability strategy with our SAP S/4HANA, which is our core products that we are bringing to our customers. Previously, I have been involved with the SDG Ambition project with UN Global Compact and Accenture, where we also talked about how companies are going on their sustainability journey, the challenges they face, and how companies like SAP and other standard bodies can help them in achieving the sustainability targets. So I'm excited to be here and excited to join you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. I'll go next. My name is Donato Calace, and I'm the Vice President of Innovation and Accounts at Datamaran. Datamaran is the only cloud platform in the world that specializes in identifying and monitoring external risk, including ESG. We use patented technology, in particular leveraging natural language processing to analyze the narrative around ESG factors in a variety of publicly available sources, including corporate annual filings, annual reports, sustainability reports, SEC filings, mandatory and voluntary policy initiatives, so from mandatory law issued by governments and parliaments to voluntary standards, like, for example, the Global Reporting Initiative standards or the SASB standards, And then we also analyze news and social media. The insights that we we generate through our AI approach in the platform are used by decision makers in companies to do exactly what you said before, Donald, as you said, that ESG was actually started by investors, and now we see that progressively is being used as a tool by decision makers in companies to take more responsible decisions and build more robust strategy. That is actually what we work on with our solution. Pleasure to be here to discuss these trends with you today.
Thanks. And Karl?
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Karl Richter, and I'm here to talk about Instance, which is an open source project that I'm very enthusiastic about. And it's inspired by the idea of creating an Internet of Impact. It's a very conscious play on the idea of the Internet of Things and trying to think big and imagine, how could the world be if we had real-time impact data? A lot of the challenges we have at the moment relate to the fact that impact as an activity happens in a very distributed way. It happens, impact is created by individuals through their purchasing decisions, or it's created by organizations as they go through their activity. And there's always a lag and a delay as that information gets rolled up. And typically we see, for example, with something like reporting carbon emissions, it can take a few years, up to 3 years, to get a really accurate carbon footprint. And that's just simply not feasible if we're expecting people to make, real-time purchasing decisions. Just imagine going shopping for your groceries and you can get a breakdown of all the prices for every item in your basket, but you wouldn't know where to start to find, the gender balance or the carbon footprint or the impact on biodiversity and so forth. So we're very inspired by a new generation of web protocols that are being led by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who founded the web way back when in 1989. And what's really exciting about these protocols is they work around a concept of linked data. And that really flicks the paradigm so that we can start accessing data at source, and we can really start working with the web as a much more powerful resource. And what we're trying to do as an open source project is promote the idea of these general purpose technologies to help us with impact. So think about the transition from fax machines to email. It was a paradigm shift, but the reason why email took off is because it's an open platform and it's an open technology. And I'll maybe pause there, and I'm sure a lot of the other detail will come up in the questions.
Great. Thanks for your introductions, everyone. And yes, please, I hope that you can tell us more about your solutions as we go through the questions. I have questions that I'm going to direct at each of you, but if anyone has a comment they want to follow up, please just jump in. I'll start with you, Karl, because you've been in the impact field, I believe, longer than any of us. So I was wondering, I gave a simple sort of introduction to what we mean when we say impact, but could you explain a little bit more of your perspective, which I think is a little bit more complex, and then also talk about why, with Instance, you identified one of the problems as being an unwillingness of data owners to share their impact data with platforms and with just publicly.
Yeah. So I find giving impact a very specific definition really difficult, because I've worked in private sector and I've worked consulting for organizations like the UN, exposed to foundations, development finance organizations, also working with people who spend their lives investing in listed securities. And for every single one of those groups, they need a slight variation on the idea. And so I start normally and I also lecture from time to time. So in the lecture work that I do, I start with a very high level definition and define impact as really a broad way of categorizing non-financial value. And that, I think, is quite a fundamental shift. For example, if we think about the fundamental theoretical framework of finance, we know about financial returns, we know about financial risk, and what we're introducing is a separate third theoretical pillar, as it were. Economists have often referred to externalities as things that are outside the calculations, and what we're trying to do is bring those into the calculations. And then for many people, we do need a very specific definition. We need to think about how our economic actions affect specific people, specific stakeholder groups. So that's groups of the population, or it could also be specific ecologies and parts of the environment. We can get very, very specific, and we can talk about things like having intentions and purpose and having deeper mission. In other words, these aren't just accidental things that happen alongside our day-to-day business, but this could actually be, the reason or one of the main reasons for actually doing a certain business activity. In terms of the challenges, I think it's complex, because a lot of people will say they want to share impact data, but they don't know how. They don't know how because of cultural barriers, organizational barriers. They may say, well, if we share impact data, we'll need all of our competitors to share impact data, and if that happens, yes, we can do it. There might also be technology barriers. Certainly one of the big issues which came up when I was leading a working group coordinated by the ABCD was there's just simply no standards. And we need to be able to get towards a position where we have interoperability. So that means if I share my data in the format that I use and I find the most valuable, other people should be able to work with it, and vice versa. And we still have not got there. And we're seeing a lot of movement when it comes to regulations and legislation and convergence of norms, moving away from a very fragmented world towards I think it's becoming tangible where we will get to that point of interoperability, and we will be able to make it easier for people to share their impact data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. I think we've seen some moves recently from the International Financial Reporting, the International Financial Reporting Services. One of you will know the name of it.
Well, there's a non-financial reporting initiative I think you might be referring to, or the...
You're talking about the IFRS?
Yes, the IFRS. Yes, they're working on international standards. That's it, standards for sustainability metrics. So to continue with this question about non-financial information, Anita, could you talk to us a little bit about how you think that businesses will start to handle non-financial information, or regulatory bodies or investors?
So I will come back to the IFRS work that has been just recently concluded. I think they had the consultation workshop last week, and exactly this point on bringing materiality close to the business was, heavily emphasized on. And I think Karl made a very important point about sharing the data or impact. So just a couple of points on that. When we are looking even within our own organizations, our data models, our infrastructure and technologies have been set up to report on something which brings us profitability. It has not been conventionally set up, which is responsible for the economy, society, and the bigger needs. So first of all, the first hurdle that companies need to process, do they have those transparency of that data where they can report, this is how we create an impact. And at the second layer, then coming to Karl's point, is how do you extend this outside your enterprise? I think, first of all, it's a journey. And the question that you asked about these standards, while these different standard-making bodies are coming together to, align, that we have a common language between businesses, what companies and businesses can do is they can look at the top areas where they're trying to drive impact. So, for example, through SDG Ambition Project, we were very, very specific in the ask the private sector that be very specific on the areas where you want to drive impact, whether it's about waste management, whether it's about gender, or it's about climate action. The more precise you are, you can start working backwards on the data that you need to report, and then hopefully by that time, teams like IFRS who are bringing these bodies together, they have also substantially moved further in their journey. So I think it's the amount of work both the organizations need to do internally, looking inward on how they are doing this responsible or sustainable reporting, and giving time to standard-making bodies to do their homework. This is how we need to align ourselves and use the impact data and further giving back that data to investors to make the right decisions.
Donata, do you have a comment on that? And also what these solutions mean for these efforts to harmonize this alphabet soup of sustainability and impact frameworks?
Sure, of course. I'm very, very happy to comment. I would say that the point that Karl made before, that we see this convergence in policy and in practice towards interoperability. It's important to look at this from the perspective of decision makers in companies, right? How they can be prepared for this convergence that we see happening in the policy. And I have some examples of working with our community of clients in that sense. So sustainability and the ESG world has been for a while quite siloed within companies, which means that many companies had either adopted a philanthropy for point of view, and that also where impact as an original idea was coming from. So having impact for the investment you made in philanthropy. But now the ambition is to take it to the strategic level, right? Mm-hmm. So you have, because of these new policy developments and big players like the IFRS coming in, you have new attention coming from the executive leadership. So people that typically were not that much interested in philanthropy, it was like a sort of window dressing of the company, let's say. Now they're taking it to the strategic level. So we're talking about the CFO, the CRO, in some cases also the board. Now the point is that these people, one, need to be educated. So I remember talking with one of our clients in the financial services space. I won't make any names, but essentially what they said was, now, with these new policy developments, we see that my CFO is actually asking questions and wants to know what we're doing in the space, in sustainability in relation to biodiversity, for example. And then they tell me, oh, we decided that we won't care in our strategy about biodiversity. And then my contact has actually had a difficult time to explain to them that they can't just ditch biodiversity altogether. It doesn't work that way. It would be like ditching a pillar 3 of the IFRS in that sense. There is a logic behind it. So the first challenge is educating the executive leadership to really understand what are the mechanics and the logic behind these kind of decisions. And the second is bringing them evidence to demonstrate that the strategic decision can be taken with robustness, with credibility. In other terms, and also Anita mentioned materiality. It's a key concept to demonstrate that. But one of the challenges is that materiality right now in sustainability is very much characterized by stakeholder engagement.
Could I just stop you and get you to define materiality? Because I think it's very useful to understand exactly what that means for people who may not know.
Of course. Very happy to do that. So materiality comes from accounting and auditing. So originally is an accounting principle. I would say, just to keep it not very technical, but very, very practical, materiality is the principle that defines that information that is able to influence the decisions of stakeholders. Mm-hmm. Then you can find many different nuances across the different standards, from IFRS itself to the Global Reporting Initiative, SASB. They have all the different nuances of materiality, but the key idea is that material information is able to change the mind of a stakeholder in relation to a company. So bringing that back to what we were discussing before, demonstrating materiality of a specific issue, like for example biodiversity for a company, it means that you should allocate budget to projects related to that topic. You should have goals and metrics and KPIs to track your performance in relation to that topic. Now, how do you demonstrate that to your executive team so they don't go on you and say, hey, we decided to ditch biodiversity? Typically, the way companies have done that is through stakeholder engagement. So basically, they went out and spoke with the NGOs, with the employees, and gathered evidence in that sense. But often we are seeing that is not enough for a simple reason. The language that the executive team speaks is very different. And in a way, they already expect when you engage with NGOs that they have their own agenda. Chances are is that if you're talking with a human rights focused NGO, that NGO is going to tell you that human rights are paramount for your business. So their perspective is a bit subjective. Now, how do you bring evidence that is actually compelling to convince your executive team? That is the new challenge that this convergence towards interoperability is bringing to the table. And there are many different ways to do it. One way is, analyzing all these trends in policy, in reporting, in news and social media that are coming up, analyzing them systematically. This is what we do at Datamart. When we work with our clients, the platform gives them evidence that a specific topic should be on their radar because X amount of CEOs mention that topic in their CEO letters. There are X amount of companies indicating that as a risk factor in their SEC filings. There are X amount of mandatory regulations with penalties and fees on that specific topic. So it brings a much more credible base to determine why a certain topic is material.
And just to add a small point on that, the way we've also tried to do this is through the products and the services that the organization is selling. So if you are into software, in the cooks and the drinks, right? You don't really care about the amount that you invest in the plastic straw. So that's a very small financial impact. But what happens that if that straw ends up in the ocean and the backlash you get from your customers, right? So things that, you have to look through a lens of what you are selling via products and services and look the kind of problems, the impact that you're driving and the risk associated, and if those things are seen, the backlash. So taking it back to the core of business often helps, bring more clarity in, the top areas of focus where you can drive the stakeholder, the customer relation, and also get in line with what the policies and the regulatory standards are doing. So I think the closer it is to your business strategy, the closer you make the centerpiece, the more impactful, I would say, end results would be.
Anita, you also had some thoughts on what would happen once these regulatory standards start to harmonize. What happens next? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, it was actually one of the questions asked in consultation workshops, and even they were wondering that what happens tomorrow magically, all these standards speak the same language. So would the businesses be responsible overnight? I don't think so. And it goes back to the fundamentals of how businesses have been running in so many days, so many years, right? We have programmed ourselves to deliver on profits. And that's how our data models, our business processes, that's how we are designed. We have been designed to exploit the planet. Now, even if their standards and their regulations are ready, businesses are made of people. And I think Donato mentioned that the education, right? So it's very important to see who are these business process leaders, who are these CXOs sitting at the middle management who really understand the process, and can they make changes so that once the standards are all aligned, we can report the impact through the services they are selling, the products they are selling. So I think it comes back to, we have to change how our organizations are structured, how we assign roles and responsibilities to people and have a more impact kind of, outlook into it. And it's so as to, I think, we use what the purpose democratization. So the purpose cannot primarily sit at an executive level, but it comes down to the business level where they see that through their individual actions, this is how they contribute to the metrics. And this is why it is important for them to drive the businesses like that, right? Because if this mindset is not there, our frameworks can all be aligned, but our people are not showing the commitment to deliver to them. So I think it's work needed on both the sides, and I think more heavy lifting on the business side to be clear and how they achieve this journey, and how do they, educate their teams to deliver on these topics.
Okay. Karl, in terms of what we need to do to make progress on this, what do you think needs to change sort of in the regulatory environment and also in say, business culture?
Yeah, and I think that to maybe preempt the answer, these changes are happening. In terms of regulations, for a long time it's been required and mandatory for companies to report a certain degree of financial information. And there was a lot of resistance when that came in originally, and now that's an accepted norm. And companies report their basic level of financial information, whether they're a micro organization, a small startup, entrepreneur, or in the case of a listed organization, they'll report according to a similar structure, but at an incredible amount of detail. And so we need to introduce that kind of a normative approach in terms of non-financial reporting. And if we go back to the definition of impact, and we think about some of the very specific definitions, such as how to assess the effects on a specific stakeholder group, or how do we assess the intentions of our investment. If we're asking all organizations to report at that level in a general way, I think it will almost be impossible. The amount of reporting fatigue will simply cripple the process. So we need to think and ask ourselves, what is fundamentally important, to use the term materiality in a slightly different way. What is material for us as a planet in terms of our global objectives? What information do we need collectively across all businesses so that we can make collective decisions in a better way? So things that affect us all relate to aspects like climate change, biodiversity, ocean acidification, access to health, sanitation, a lot of the common terms that sit within the SDGs. And then to make the process easier, we can look at specific economic activities and identify what basic level information is required against each of those activities. In the conversation early on about materiality, and I think Anita picked on it, we need to focus on products and be able to identify specific level of reporting at that level of granularity, because if you think of an automotive manufacturer, they could make diesel cars, petrol cars, electric cars. We need to be able to differentiate the different types of information based on the fundamental product, how it's going to be used, how it's manufactured, and of course its full lifetime impact. And what is exciting is that we are seeing those norms evolve and establish. And when it comes to organizations and businesses, perhaps one of the initial areas of resistance might be to say, well, if we report that degree, that granularity of information, well, that gives people a window into our intellectual property. If we reveal that information about our supply chain, then people can potentially reverse engineer our product. And so we need to be really careful about that, because we need to be realistic with the expectations of how much information we need from the organizations. But I think there is a balance where we can reasonably ask companies to report at an aggregate level, quantitative information. What is your total tonnage of carbon emitted in the supply chain? What is the on aggregate balance of gender equality in your supply chain, water consumption, and so forth, where these bits of information don't necessarily reveal specific elements of intellectual property, but that are very useful for others to then factor into macro level analysis.
And Karl, the way you mentioned about measuring your impact on these specific SDG targets, what you see, I think, coming back to the question, as we grow more mature in being transparent on these specific areas, we can link them back to the finance. So the impact-based accounting would be a natural follow from SDG-based accounting. So SDGs will be making more insights about how much water do you use, what is your carbon emission. And at the next level, where where teams like VBA, Valuable and Single Alliance, they're bringing those insights and making them very relevant and bridging the gap between financial accounting and SDG accounting. And that's where we would look more and more companies doing integrated reporting. That's where I definitely see would be the right kind of future which private sector wants to head into.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of how these platforms can advance the SDGs achievements. Does anyone else want to address what it is in particular about a technological solution that actually makes it easier to make progress on the individual targets?
I can give it a start, and Karl and Donato, please feel free to take over. Fundamentally, first thing I think is that you have to be clear about the journey. What is the process of going and measuring on those impacts? And I think even before you get to the technology question, the question is, what are you trying to measure? How does the value come out of your products, services, out of your core business strategy? And then where does that data lie? Is it within your enterprise or is it outside across the life cycle? In the beginning of the panel, Karl gave a very good example on carbon emissions, right? There is some amount of data which is outside our value chains, which does not have any IP, but it would fundamentally help the ecosystem to share that kind of data. So I would say encouraging sharing of data externally where it does not have any IP to move the industry per se forward in being more sustainable. And if you look inward, to use technology, so first of all, to re-engineer or re-look into our processes to run them more sustainably. Or once you have those data insights, to really see that, this is how I need to use AI, machine learning, or other emerging technologies to solve that challenge. Now, what SAP is doing is, of course, we are at the heart of supply chain. So we do understand that's where we own the radar of the transaction, of these companies. But with SDG Ambition, when we had this outside-in view with UN Global Compact, it was very clear to us that even though the CEOs are absolutely clear that they want to go behind the SDG target, the middle management still struggles on the how. And that's where we talked about the approach with SDG Ambition. And when it comes to implementing it using the system, it has to be a combination. You have to look at a couple of factors, right? What kind of systems do you actually have versus, where you want to team up with external data providers. So we have been working on carbon emissions, on responsible supply chains, and even bringing more insights into the waste, right? But for most of that, we have to remember the externalities which are playing in, which are into play, and how do we creatively work with different partners, either our implementation partners or technology partners, to really drive the transparency in data. And only then, I think, together as an industry, we would be able to kind of pivot and do just a marginally bit better. So I think those were my thoughts on this question.
Mm. And if I can add to that as well, I think Karl and Anita were very clear in explaining how technology facilitates and in some cases even enables collecting the necessary evidence to measure your impacts, being those within the perimeter of your organization or outside. But there is also another challenge that I would say it's sort of implied, so it's less visible, but it's still there. And the challenge is, let's keep in mind that the SDGs are Agenda 2030, and the world doesn't end on 2030, hopefully. There are already, if you read online blogs that talk about what is missing from the SDGs, and maybe we should add an SDG on topic X, on tax or human capital. There are many different positions there. This is a reflection of the fact that the ESG word or sustainability word, whatever label you want to use for this, is a sort of evolving landscape with always new aspects emerging. So I think one of the challenges in managing all this stuff is that, one, you have to have the capabilities and the technological infrastructure to go deep, so to measure the impacts. But second, you also need a process and the technology and the capabilities to keep a sort of horizon scanning process. So that, this year we've seen many companies committing to net zero carbon emission goals, which is great. But next year there will be another issue that companies will start to focus on, and there will be more. And some of these issues become standardized in frameworks and in law. Some others are, still emerging there. So being able to capture what's emerging, what's brewing, can help companies be prepared to that convergence towards interoperability. So my point is, there are two levels there. One that is going vertical in the measuring the impacts, and the other is more, about the breadth of the horizon of issues that are emerging.
Yeah, I liked when you and I spoke before this, how you mentioned COVID-19 revealed to us a bunch of sustainability issues that have a major non-financial and financial impact. So there's a lot of things that can happen in the future that will reveal whole aspects of sustainability that we haven't even considered yet. On a more practical level, I'm curious, you gave some examples of your experience talking to CEOs after they had engaged with Datamaran. Anita or Donato, do you have other examples of how people have used your tool, and then from what they've learned from using the tool that they didn't know before, they started to ask for more aspects of their business that they hadn't thought about previously?
I'm happy to go first, Anita. So I would say the typical journey that we have with our clients is a journey where they start with benchmarking themselves, because we are in a reality where there are already ESG ratings and rankings and some performance measurements. So benchmarking their performance against peers or the other companies in their network, it's a very intuitive idea there. So it's a good starting point. But actually, then the question becomes why we are benchmarking ourselves on carbon emissions and not human capital management, or not issue X. How would you define the set of issues that you really want to benchmark on? So it becomes more about strategy. So the second step of our journey is identifying those material issues in a strategic way beyond just the reporting scope, because typically materiality assessments are used to identify what is material and should go in a sustainability report. But there is also a strategic value attached to it. And the final step of that journey is the integration into the existing risk management processes of the companies. And typically those are very inward focused. So when you talk with a risk management team, they know all about the data about their supply chain and raw materials, and if there are any risk of stops in that value chain flow. But when it comes about external data, so data that doesn't come, it's not within the perimeter of the company, they're really in the dark. So the next step of the implementation is actually opening a window on the external world and capturing those signals that tell you that something is emerging, and maybe you should start to build that infrastructure to collect that kind of information, essentially. And this process goes up to the board itself, because the board in the end is in charge of questioning management, making sure that management is doing what they should do in order to ensure the sustainability of the company. And I'm talking sustainability from a broader perspective, not only environmental and social, but also economical, like the survival of the company over time, right? So they need to have the right knowledge to ask the right questions to management, and management should have the right answers to these questions. So that is the kind of journey that we see along the maturity of the company as well.
We're going to have to wrap it up in a few minutes. So Anita, could you respond in about a minute? And then Karl, if you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to throw in, you could wrap it up for us.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, I think I would just carry forward what Renato said. The journey is more important, and wherever we've had these kind of conversations with customers in the last couple of years, it's more about looking into their own services or the project they're running, and how do you do them in a more sustainable way. So if it is about managing stocks, what do you do to reduce wastage at the end of the day? You take that food produced and, distribute it out in the community. Or if you're looking at, transportation logistics, while you are optimizing your transportation network, how can that also help reduce carbon emissions in the same point? So we are trying to see that, first of all, it's important for the customers and the businesses to understand that these problems can be solved looking inward. And the second thing which we are working on, because these businesses are so huge, they are often running siloed projects on either CSR or trying to make impact in their own small way. It's very important that if you have to show impact, these are collectively brought forward. And I think, Donato, as you mentioned, to the board level, that here are the top projects the organization want to work on in a structured way. So I think with SAP, a lot of our enterprises, they are already on this journey, while some are ahead in setting their targets than the others. But I think it's time for, they're looking into their own organization and trying to drive the change from there.
Great. Karl, any final comments?
Yeah, I'd like to finish with a forward-looking idea, and I often use the following analogy when trying to explain to people what the potential might be if we had an Internet of Impact. And we're very familiar, if we go to a foreign city, of the books that, the travel books that we might take around with us, Lonely Planet or such like. And that's a little bit like we're navigating, how we're navigating the world of sustainability information and impact information. There's always an inherent bias in that book. We trust the brand. But it's very different to how we often navigate foreign cities with a smartphone in our pocket. We won't have a catalog of books. We won't just have more of those guides and look through the index and navigate in the same way, but just with more data. We use a very different technology. We use search. And the apps on our phones are able to pull together an incredible amount of information, live arrival times of buses and trains, and live traffic congestion information. And the way we go about making those decisions, or at least how the technology helps us make those decisions, is different. We use search to then optimize our journey, and we can then decide if we want to take the journey based on the shortest route, based on rail or road, or based on a main motorway or something else. And hopefully similarly we could do that with impact data, and then use the impact data to optimize our business decisions around a number of different factors that are relevant and material for us. And hopefully that's an encouraging note, because the technology exists, we just have to harness it for impact.
Great. Thank you so much, Anita, Donato, Karl. It's a very exciting subject. I look forward to see how it develops in the next years, and maybe we can check in a year or two from now and see where we are. Thank you so much.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.